Good afternoon, everyone. This is Alan Murabayashi speaking to you from PhotoShelter. We are very fortunate today to have Newsweek's senior international photo editor, Jamie Wellford, on the line. Before we start, I want to give you a little logistical information. First of all, as we do with all of the webinars, we are recording this, so in case you have to cut out early, or in case you never hear this in the first place, it will be available online on our blog later this week. And there's also a question panel to the right of your computer screen. It's the GoToWebinar control panel. And from there, you can ask us questions as we go along. We'll do our best to try to ask Jamie as we move along with the most important questions that you guys are asking. And we'll intersperse those with his conversation. But with that, let me introduce Jamie Wellford.
Hi, Alan. Hi, everybody who's tuning in.
Let's get straight to the bio here.
Did I send you a long one or a short one?
This looks like it's only 4 bullet points. You must be a young guy.
That's a short one.
So we have you graduating from Brown University and then going almost immediately into photo editing. How did you get into the photography world?
I got into the photography world because when I left Brown University, I traveled to Asia, and once upon a time, I tried to make pictures. I then came back to New York City. I fell in love with someone, and I needed to make a living in order to stay here and stay with her. So I got a job at Gamma Liaison. That's how it all started.
It's amazing how those little choices make all the difference, huh?
It goes back quite a ways, though, 1987. I mark time by history, and that was when the second Intifada was raging in Israel and Gaza.
So you cut your teeth pretty early, and then in 2001 moved over to Newsweek?
I did indeed. I mean, I worked at any number of agencies. I did a lot of freelance work at various magazines, but to do justice to the agencies, it's really one of the best places to cut your teeth. They're a different puppy right now, but in agencies, you got to know a lot of photographers and you worked through enormous amounts of material and stories.
So
you a bit about photography.
You kind of jump into a national weekly magazine, one of the the biggies in 2001, and September 11th happens. Can you kind of tell us what that experience was like?
Well, mine was a little bit interesting. You know, I came just a bit before the 9/11 experience here in New York. I came when Milosevic fell in the Balkans, all the way back when he fell from power in Belgrade. But I wanted to say one thing about getting the job at Newsweek. The way I got the job at Newsweek is because I met the then editor, Sarah Harbett, on the F train in New York, and as an editor and a researcher at the agencies earlier on, particularly Gamma Liaison, I was her researcher when she was at Newsweek. So she asked me to come over. I then came over, joined the team, and then we go up to 9/11. 9/11, I happened to be attending a photo festival in Europe at Perpignan. Many people will know that festival, and was stuck like so many others trying to get back to New York. I was in Zurich when the planes hit the towers, I should say, and it was 3 days before I got back. Meanwhile, all hell had broken loose in the United States, and often I regret not being in the thick of it. I was trying to get back into New York.
Yeah.
Others were sleeping all night long in the office and trying to just sift through the enormous amounts of work that were produced on that day.
Were you working on the international desk when you started?
I was, in fact. I mean, that's always been my interest. I've always been driven by the cosmopolitan world, the broader dimensions of what happens around the globe and how those ultimately affect the relationships both with this country and throughout the world. I just find it gripping and fascinating. I still do. 9/11 at some level was instrumental in bringing people's attention back to the greater world. I remember quite clearly when 9/11 happened, most people had absolutely no idea who the Taliban were. And suddenly everybody was being dispatched to Afghanistan. Before that, international news was a difficult thing to cover. 9/11 changed all that.
We're going to see some work from Afghanistan and covering the Taliban in a little bit, but tell us kind of briefly about Seen Unseen.
Scene Unseen was a project that I started together with a colleague of mine, Jake Price, who's a photographer and a filmmaker. And we thought it would be nice to find an avenue or a way to show broader bodies of work. When you work at a magazine, you see a tremendous amount of powerful work, but you often can only run a very limited number of images. So through the kindness of my wife, who has a champagne bar in downtown New York, in Tribeca, we commandeered the space and we put up various projects. It all started with, in fact, the tsunami in 2004, going all the way back to the Indian Ocean tsunami, but we've subsequently done them on the Kashmir earthquake, Afghanistan, the Lebanon-Israel war, several projects on the calamities in Japan with the recent tsunami and nuclear fallout, a number of other projects. And what we try to do is also raise awareness for the community beyond the photography community, and generally do fundraisers.
That's so funny because I actually live across the street from what I assume is the Bubble Lounge.
228 West Broadway, right at the end of White Street. You've never come in?
I've been there several times, but now I will patronize it more now that I know that there's a
You
connection.
need to come to the events, and so does everybody else.
Yeah.
It's exciting to see. I don't want to say photography in the raw, but if you have someone like a Balazs Gardi or a Teru Koyama or a Kusaka Stanley Green, the list is very lengthy of people who have been there and shown their work. And it's really a pretty energized space when people are generous enough to show what they do.
You have four bullet points about what you believe photojournalism should do, I guess at least for the audience. Why don't you take us through these 4 points here?
Sure. I mean, did I write this? No, I wrote this. Photography that elicits a response and emotion. I mean, I have been privileged in many ways to engage, in my humble opinion, some of, I think, the most creative photographers working in the last 15, 20 years. But I defy anyone to look at a picture, for instance, by Eugene Richards and not feel the emotion in it. That is also true of Luc Delahaye. That is true of Lindsay Addario. The names are endless. But this ability to actually channel feeling and emotion in space is something I deeply believe in. And if someone has that talent, then please come and see me. Focus on covering big, complicated world events. I mean, I sat yesterday in a class at the International Center of Photography and invited a very young photographer to speak at the front end of the class, Nicole Tung, who has been really only for the last year been spending time covering conflict. What impressed me about what she had to say was how deeply, deeply informed she was about events unfolding in that region. And where she didn't know ideas, it was clearly defined to not just me, but everybody in the class, that she was working hard to make sense of the complicated issues that are now pervasive in Libya. And I use that as a description. So many people are deeply informed about events before they go to them. This isn't always the case, but it's often where I get enormous amounts of information from frontline photographers, journalists, people embarking on stories, whether they're in Iraq, Sri Lanka, Thailand. They're generally, beyond very good image makers, enormously articulate and thoughtful people. And I love that.
Do you think, though, that this is, I mean, kind of an elitist view of photojournalism in terms of like it has to kind of be these big worldly events and elicit a response versus
Well, but
what somebody might be
the
doing
point
locally?
about it is we go that takes us to actually the third bullet point: feature
Yeah.
stories that might not get as much attention as they deserve. I don't think there have to be bombs in Tripoli or Benghazi to make it an important story. In fact, most talented journalists have the capacity to shoot the quiet of a maddening world. And I mean, it can also be celebratory. Don't get me wrong. You can shoot parades or demonstrations that aren't just about death and mayhem and do considerably good bodies of work. But most of the things which are going on in the world today are in fact neglected if at some level there isn't an explosion or a familiar political scenario, which generally constitutes, in the case of what I do, American soldiers in the field. Those stories are generally ignored. The list is quite long about situations like a civil war in Sri Lanka, like complications in eastern India among the Maoist Naxalites, unsettled events throughout the world are often not addressed. I mean, I look also at something very broadly defined, which is something I've wanted to support for the longest time by the Hungarian photographer Balázs Gardi. He's been doing for quite a long time now a very involved story on the issues of water. And it's absolutely exquisite, and at times when I talk about it's exquisite, it's quite subtle.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily explosive. It's a hard story to fully document, but his persistence is phenomenal to me, and his aesthetic is challenging, and I think something that people would benefit by seeing, and some have, of course. But elitist, that is an accusation that's leveled sometimes at people who think that there's only one way to show or portray news. I don't actually feel all that vulnerable to that accusation. I sort of believe in things that I think that people will respond to, will enjoy. They don't have to look at news from the Congo. They don't have to look at news from certain parts of the world. But I think when they step in to that place, when they cross that threshold and engage that story, particularly through the eyes of a talented journalist, then they're in store for something that is potentially quite surprising and potentially deeply fascinating.
And so your last point often favors disturbing or upsetting events as we kind of show a
I think
photo.
catharsis is a pretty important place to go when you're thinking visually to describe the world. And when I say catharsis, I mean, at least in my opinion, catharsis is a reaction that ultimately should be one that somehow strokes in you a feeling of compassion, consideration, care. It's always very controversial to run an image which is as devastating as something like what we're looking at right now, Don Weber's image from the apocalyptic moments in Japan. But I don't think he intentionally went out to shock anyone with what he was doing, because the rest of this take is not as challenging in terms of showing bodies in this situation. At the same time, there's something so abstract in this picture, so telling about vulnerability, that I thought it was more than compelling enough to run. Also, Don, in this case, was on assignment for us, and I just found that it articulated a pretty dreadful situation quite poignantly.
When you
Remember this thing
decide to
about
run,
photography and approach, at some level it is very subjective. You put a picture out there like this to at some level engage people in conversation, and there's no doubt in my mind some people will reject the power of an image like this. And yet for many others, it might be one of the closest things to sort of reconciling the sheer magnitude of the disaster over there more than many others they might have seen. The scale was enormous. That's a very detailed image. We move on. Don's interest when he went there was actually to look at the fallout of the Fukushima nuclear plant. So he was bouncing around that zone and entering towns which to a large extent had been evacuated. I mean, to some degree, Don's compelling desire to go to Japan was based on the nuclear fallout, because he had spent years and actually has a book on the Chernobyl issue. He lived in Ukraine for as many as 7 years, maybe more. So nuclear fiasco was something that deeply interested him.
when you run
But he
an
has a
image
wonderful
that's sort of
film
provocative,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
when you run an image that's so provocative with, a body in the mud like that, do you guys get a lot of comments from readers that
Quite
say,
a few.
yeah,
Quite a few. I mean, I'm not, and I wish that I was privy to more that people wrote in. Once upon a time, I had a very good friend in the letters department. And the letters department, of course, are the people who sift through all the different letters that are sent in response to stories at Newsweek. And occasionally would run one related to photography, but at that time, this woman would send me many letters that responded to photography, many that never read. And it was interesting to see responses to photography, which alone is a very powerful and provoking thing. You know, people are responding to an image and it makes them want to write a response, then something's working.
Shifting scenes now from Japan.
I got a call from an Italian man, Paolo Marchetti, and he sent me a body of work from Haiti. This is his look at the chimère, the gangs of Cité Soleil in Port-au-Prince, one of the most devastated and poor areas in the Western Hemisphere, in fact. I had no idea he was working on this story. I perhaps had talked to him once or twice in the past few years, but he sent this body of work on these gang members and literally fighting in the neighborhood. And I just felt compelled to present it and with a chance of running it. And our wonderful international editor jumped at the opportunity.
How often are kind of photographers who you don't know sending you work that ends up being published versus people that you've worked with for, a decade or more?
It's an interesting question. I mean, increasingly, that with the world as we know it, and there's so much talent in the world. There's so many people engaging different parts of the world. Haiti was definitely not on the list of things that they thought to run in the magazine. But Paulo is an example of one of those many creative people out there engaging in story, and I think a very, very full way, finding an outlet. I feel very, very lucky that I am one of the outlets for people. But to answer your question, my batting average is probably not great. I wish it was much better for the benefit of all those talented and engaged people out in the world. But I try, and then I consider this a success.
Yeah, I guess in terms of trying to get your attention, sending you a few images is still kind of the best way to,
It's a mandatory way that
yeah.
it's impossible to engage every single story that is sent because my email is literally chock full of things which are, if I call them speculative, it makes sense. They're not necessarily lined up on our story list to run. Much of what I do is a reaction to what people within the magazine are looking for. So that's an enormously consuming part of my day, but I have a very difficult time not accepting people sending me links and engaging me about stories. Obviously, I can't fulfill, what I would like to in terms of running much more than I do, but I've always believed that you have to, photography is also an editorial pastime, and it's enormously important to pitch the stories of people in the world. And when I can, I do.
Can
If you
you
look at this
talk
work by
to,
Paolo, it channels so much emotion and feeling to me. It is very important to get that out in the world.
can you talk to us about how important you think photo contests are in terms of garnering attention to the photographers and their personal projects?
I still believe at some level that they are important. Just to be recognized, to be given some degree of attention, and at some level being celebrated for the work that you do. Is it everything? Certainly it is not. And sometimes I'm troubled by the notion, which I've been part of before, where you choose first, second, and third. That's always a somewhat difficult thing to do for me because I see so much good work from so many different places that troubles me. I always know at the end of contest season they're very good bodies of work that have not been celebrated. But at the same time, I think it's a moment where everyone stands back and puts their hands together to celebrate the people who are recognized. I mean, at any level to celebrate, photojournalism, photography, visual language, storytelling through pictures. Contests are one more place to reflect on that. To
Are
celebrate, which
there
is a very diverse assortment of pictures usually at the contest, so that I celebrate.
are there specific contests that you see as being more successful in helping promote
I think they're
photographers' work?
all at some level very controversial. Certainly, it's inevitable that people agree and disagree over things, which leads to some great conversations that often go on late into the night. But I think the world press is a standard bearer at some level, and I say that because it's an open contest and it accepts work from all over the world and it's free. So
Right.
whether you're from Bangladesh or whether you're from Colombia, whether you're from the United States, Japan, any of these places, people traditionally submit to that contest. So it's a big deal. And over the years, they've recognized quite a few very, very significant people. But, you know, whether it is POY, whether it is PX3, the smaller contests, I have to have a shout out for Daylight magazine, which conducts a really, really nice contest. And for all of those listening to me, you should submit your work there. It's an exercise, and it's also a point for people to edit their work if they have to write a statement or an explanation. It's kind of a nice exercise to do that and submit your work. What happens, we don't know, but it allows you to consider your work in the context of 15 images and try to make sense of it. So in general, I celebrate them. I wish more of them came with a big financial prize, but fortunately some of them do.
You've kind of survived not only regime change over at Newsweek, you've also seen a tremendous transition and upheaval of what's going on in the publishing industry. And these are kind of interesting points, I guess, ending with the smaller capacity to assign new work. Why don't you kind of take us through what you've seen in the past 11 years?
Well, you know, when I first came to this magazine, we had a masthead of photographers, and I mean, in addition to everybody else.
Oh, looks like we might have lost Jamie's audio there. Let's hang on here and see if he reappears. Jamie, are you still there? Sorry, folks, having a little technical difficulty.
Went
Oh,
in a
there we
number
go.
of directions. And I was sad to see them go. But one thing that I've found, having been here for more than a decade, is most of the people that I worked with during that time who were on the contract remained very faithful to Newsweek. And I wish I could get all of them more work than I do. But there's a certain rapport with people like Alex Majoli and Paolo Pellegrini and several others that is, you know, it still at times even makes me emotional because I think, well, you no longer owe us anything, but we've done so much together that they stick by their relationships to us, which does not mean that they don't shoot for everyone else. In fact, I encourage them to shoot for everyone else. They need to make a living. But, you know, Laurent Vanderstock and Luc Delahaye and Charles Almané and Quay Bui and even Chris Anderson, all of these people have to a large extent shaped, my aesthetic in this world of journalism. So I'm indebted to all of them. But in addition to those people, there's so many wonderful journalists out there. So it was never meant to exclusively only be that group of people. But there was a security in having them as regular contributors. So it's a little bit of a loose way to answer your question.
So you're pulling a lot of imagery off the wire,
Quite a
and
bit.
presumably using that stuff in the well, as well as for some feature pieces as well?
Yeah, often. I mean, the thing about the wires is I must admit that I absolutely love them. It doesn't mean that I always find what I'm looking for, but more often than not, I do find I can't say the word, startlingly good pictures. But you think about the caliber in places like AP with David Gutenfelder and Jerome Delay, and the names just go on and on and on. Rodrigo Abt, Reuters as well, just Finbar O'Reilly. There's an enormous amount of talent in the wires. And so they are places that I think fundamentally must go to look at because I often use the wires to educate myself about what's going on in the world. Very
So similar to photo contests, then are wires almost a place to discover new talent
a
in some
lot of times,
respects? Yeah.
sure, sure. I mean, it's funny, when I worked through the Iraq War with a number of people, no question about it. By the end of that conflict or midway through it, you were very, very familiar with the Iraqi contributors to places like Reuters and AP and AFP, because very few other people could get out and engage the story. They did a
So
wonderful job developing people for that. So names then become familiar to you. You feel like you know people that, in fact, you've never met. I mean, I'll say, for instance, John Moore, the great John Moore, who's now a Getty photographer. When I first um, knew his work, he was shooting for AP. I monitored him all the way through AP and used his work consistently. But it's a funny story. There was a picture that he took a number of years ago where he was embedded at Abu Ghraib prison, infamous for the pictures of torture and detention. John actually went after those pictures came out and shot a harrowing series of pictures, to continue the conversation about detention. And I saw one that I simply could not believe was true. Showed it to the editors. They were amazed by it. It basically showed a restrained inmate with an American military guy over his shoulder. And we reached out to John to confirm that it was an accurate picture. But when John wrote back to me, since my name is Jamie, although I'd known his work for years and years and years, I think he was convinced I was a girl. And I still tease him about that. We were very, very good friends, but oh my Lord, what a picture.
when someone's walking down the street nowadays, and so many people have DSLRs, and so many people have camera phones, etc. And let's say, I'm witness to the Arab Spring, or I'm witness to something on Wall Street. How do I get that image to you if it's completely unique?
People do all sorts of things. If they are a photographer, they'll certainly be able to find an address, a phone number, channel it some way. If they are just a pedestrian walking down the street and the planes actually hit the towers, I think people cold call. They try to find the photo department. There's a regular number of inquiries that I get even when there isn't quote unquote dramatic news, where someone will say, I've been at this event. I was on a political campaign. Can you look at my pictures? And I try to entertain as much of that as I possibly can, to the extent that I have time. But there's a lot of curiosity out of there, and that's part of the reason that I remain pretty fascinated and absorbed by photography, because I just think it's such a channel into the wonder and the curiosity of the world. And I think a lot of people who see, for instance, the images we have up right now, taken by Teru Koyama and Balazs Gardi, people who've seen these images, who have responded to them, that will never even know, that those two photographers will never, ever even know. And I think there's a real power in that. I think it's still a pretty provocative form. It's under duress all the time, but a good picture, when it's in the press, or when it's, even on the web, but I work primarily with paper, when it's there and it distributes to a lot of places around this country, and in our case, luckily enough, around the world, people respond. I
So
can't have a
let's talk about these
conversation
for a
without
second, because
them.
this wasn't an assignment. This wasn't a commission piece. This was actually a personal project that Teru was working on. And not
Yeah,
only that, they were taken with a Hipstamatic iPhone app.
correct. So I encourage you definitely to set up the next webinar with Teru Koyama. He's very, very erudite and thoughtful. Have you done one with him yet?
We haven't, but I've read some
Okay, yeah,
interviews, and
he's
he's
an
a smart
interesting guy,
guy.
because I've known Teru now for years, as I've known Balazs and the other people who contributed to this project, include Tividar and Rita Leisner. But for years he's been going out to Afghanistan and Pakistan to work on issues about the region. And he's shot all sorts of cameras out there, including 35 straight up color on assignment for me. But he's also shot a lot of Holga. He's challenged conventions in many ways, not always needing to meet a deadline, but coming back after 2, 3 months of being in the field and bringing his work into the office. I mean, there was a time where we had a lab and we would process his work. And, he'd give us a shot at trying to run some of it. And on occasion, we did run it. And over the years, we've run quite a bit of Teru's work. And the same is true with Balazs. He then took, and for those not familiar with it, there's the Knight Fellowship for journalists out of Stanford University, and Teru was accepted to that. But look at that picture with the bag over the head. I'm sorry, is that me? That's a Balazs picture, but I just think instamatic or not, or hipstamatic, I should say. It's a pretty astonishing visual moment.
So what do you say to the people who say this is just a gimmick? These art filters are, bullshit.
I say and then I'll come back to Terry really quickly about
Yeah.
the Knight Foundation. My feeling about it is I have specific cameras, I suppose, that I like, but at the same time, I suddenly back up as time has gone on, and I've worked with people like Luc Delahaye or Teru Koyama, people who use different forms of camera. Another one, Kai Wiedenhofer, who did the Walls project, this crazy panoramic project. For me, the thing that informs a picture more than anything else is actually who's standing behind it and shooting the camera. And I think people with talent and vision can almost use any device and render something that can be deeply provocative and meaningful. I'm not a big fan of altering pictures and all the rest of it, but that argument goes all the way back to the darkroom and how things are played with in a darkroom setting.
Yeah.
The hipstamatic, it remains kind of unresolved. I know quite a few people who reject it. I didn't go to this work or even consider it in terms of hipstamatic. I considered it because it was a project done by Balazs Gardi and Teru Koyama and Tividar and Rita. And I think all of them over time have proven that they are exceptional photographers. And the project that Teru essentially organized when he came out of that Knight Foundation grant was, these images come from that.
I mean, this is in essence kind of the way that we shoot a square format in the digital age, since we don't carry Hasselblads around anymore, huh?
Exactly, it's good, but people are still carrying Hasselblads.
Right.
Some are. You
Yeah.
just have to slow down a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with slowing down, people. If you have the time to engage and you can slow down, I realize it's virtually impossible in this world. But I draw everyone's attention to people like Philip Blenkinsop. Many photographers believe that slowing down is an important thing to do sometimes to make a good frame. I kind of agree with them.
Was there any concern when you ran these to annotate the photos as photo illustrations, or that they had been processed in some sort of way?
There was a consideration. There was a consideration. I mean, I felt that what was in the frame of the pictures was not manipulated. I realize the layering and the way that the hipstamatic works is controversial. But for me, at the moment, with the pace of the piece, I stuck to what was in the frame.
Now, this was a
They were
case
not
where
altering things and tying their shawls and turbans. They were shooting it pretty straight up.
this was a
It's
case
kind of
where
hard to
Taru was working on this project, and what did the photos precede the written content, or was it the
I
other way
think it was sort of done over the space of I think at least a year, and people can go to look at the site. It's called basetrack.org, and it's a quite phenomenal undertaking. And there you can see the writing, the maps, the interactive reality of this project, and I'm quite sure people will get something from it.
Newsweek's role and responsibility?
Did I write this?
I think it was a distillation of points that you had made.
Okay. Shall I read
Um,
them out? Or you want to read
well,
them?
give us your philo. I mean, you're a very learned. You seem to know a lot about what's going on in the world, and so give us
I'm
your kind of
trying to
take on
find out.
photography.
You and it's humbling to know that much about the world. I work at it. And so I mean, I'm not reading these right now, but let me go ahead and do it. Role and responsibility. When you work in the press, you try to the extent that you possibly can to get stories out to as many people as possible. And how do you provoke people's attention? What is important in the world that we live in right now? I happen to fall on that side of being interested in history and the cumulative effects of, what our destiny is going to be if we don't bring certain things under control. And one of those things is conflict and war, with offshoots of rape and abuse and things like that. I find that a pretty absorbing series of stories to stay continuously engaged in. But I'm the product of looking at things like Larry Burroughs in Vietnam, born in '61. Early in my life, I remember seeing helicopters on the television set, and then by the mid '80s, when I was coming out of school, things were raging in Central America, Nicaragua and Salvador, and of course a lot of people were cutting their teeth down there. Nicholsburg, Susan Meisalas, and Noctway. So it was again a moment of actually looking at people that I felt were channeling stories that, at least in my world, I found compelling and fascinating. Politics, history, that sort of thing have always deeply compelled me, and to a large extent that's how I got into this field. And I just happened to find that the people who are present with cameras perhaps are closer than anyone else to the stories that are unfolding around the world. But yeah, in saying that, I talk to photographers on the phone. I do see a lot of links, but I try, when it's possible, to engage in conversation, involve conversations, myself with photographers, to talk about what they're doing, where they're going, and somehow why they're interested in going there, because I remain perpetually curious about that. So go ahead.
There's a people say that in Europe there's a higher tolerance and more publication space for sort of long form photojournalism. Where do you kind of look at international magazines and newspapers and compare and contrast how Newsweek is able to use photography, and what are
I
the
mean, I
pros and
do.
cons?
When I look through them, obviously, if I see a layout that does justice to a body of work over 10 pages, I have to admit it. Sometimes I have a little bit of envy. I rarely get that kind of space to run anything, and certainly domestically, I almost never do. But the international magazine at Newsweek, in my humble opinions, run some pretty damn good essays this past year. And I don't want to use the word competitive, but I think we're at the party. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? We have some talented people here, and we feel pretty strongly about the bodies of work that we see, and try to do a pretty broadly defined take on the world. But again, the editor Tunku is a great supporter of visual ideas. Very talented to see them. So the range can be from interrogations by Don Weber to Haiti by Paolo Mosciate, or straight on news stories that come out of Afghanistan, you name it. You consider pretty much everything. But yeah, I should say one other thing about that. If I see a great essay in any other magazine, whether it is Time, whether it is Le Monde, the Italians, I always celebrate that. Any outlet for a good photograph is something I deeply support. And of course, if you do this long enough, you have colleagues in a lot of different magazines.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's celebrate, creativity, visual creativity, and anyone who has a chance to run it, I celebrate you.
How often are you doing portfolio, kind of in-person portfolio reviews, and are you at festivals doing that and
I love doing that. I
meetups?
just did one in Ottawa. As often as I possibly can go to the festivals, I encourage that. I mean, I think it's a time for people to engage, to share work. I believe in looking at portfolios. I looked at one today. I'm going to look at one tomorrow. I try to get a bunch of people in every week. There's a selfish part of me that way. When I sit at a desk all day, I like to hear ideas.
Yeah.
And I like to see new work, and I like to listen to stories. To me, I find that, animates my mind, my imagination, and it's good for other people around.
Are
So I
you
do try to
also
encourage that. It just, you run out of time, you can't see everybody, but it's good for an atmosphere to engage people routinely and look at what they're doing.
do you look at work on blogs at all? What do
I
you
do
look
a
at
little
online?
bit. I do a little bit, but I'm accused sometimes of being a Luddite. Sorry, that was my phone. I still use number two pencils and a doodle. I look at a lot of links. I read a lot of books. I love fiction, and I should blog more, but because of my position, I get an enormous amount of work sent to me all the time. Often when I leave the office, I listen to the radio. But I always intend to get deeper and deeper into blogs, which is kind of an unfortunate word to describe a gateway into such creative thinking, and that's just me. Don Weber, I mean, his interrogations piece, in my opinion, is certainly got to be one of the most psychologically deep and powerful portrait series done, maybe ever, but certainly in the last bunch of years.
Can you give us the context around these images?
Well, the context is ever growing. Don is coming out with a book entitled Interrogations this fall. He spent a large number of years, I think as many as 6, trying to get into the interrogation rooms in this part of Ukraine that he was working in, and eventually he got in through a contact. But I encourage everyone to look at the book, because his essay actually on looking at the interrogator, those being interrogated, he writes beautifully about, in a sense, looking at the interrogators through the eyes of these people who are really reduced to such submission and fear and vulnerability. But his captions are just genius on them, because he keeps them quite simple. I can't remember if this child was a thief, but they're very simple. It will say prostitution, car theft, drug dealer. Can't remember what this boy was doing, but
Is there a responsibility of news organizations to sort of counteract a skepticism of the public to say these were staged? This is
well, I mean,
photoshopped.
that is an accusation that justifiably is leveled at news organizations. Sometimes you need to be positioned to defend yourself if, in fact, you have not admitted to staging something. I don't. I take no issue with that at all. I've had to do it a number of times in my career where people have written in and accused, particularly once the digital age started, accused photographers in the field of staging something. And what I have done routinely is generally take the writer and put them in touch with the photographer to hammer that issue out.
Yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, I have never that's never happened to me. The thing is, you're utterly dependent on the integrity and honesty of the people that work in the field, and my experience has been overwhelmingly positive that way. There are a lot of personalities out there, but I have generally no reason to think that most of the people, if not all the people I've worked with, haven't actually been very ethical and moral and honest in what they do. It's a really important relationship that has to be established with someone when I sit in an office in New York and someone is in Central Africa.
Yeah.
Depend on them entirely for their integrity, honesty, creativity, energy. In fact, I need them to do everything. Really
Speaking
do.
of which, this is, I'm sure a lot of the audience wants to know how they can pitch you guys on stories. So give us kind of the typical scenario of how people effectively pitch stories, and everything from should the images that they submit have a watermark on it so that you don't lose the name of the photographer in the shuffle?
If a story grabs your attention, you're not going to forget the name of the photographer. And if for some reason it's not attached, you'll eventually dig it up. I mean, There's a Greek photographer that I saw his work certainly more than 2 years ago, Angelos Sorsinas. I can't pronounce his name correctly, but I saw a body of work that he had done on illegal immigration into Greece. And I printed out a couple of those images, and then they were just on my desk. I have large numbers of things I like lying around my desk. Unfortunately, the space I work in has gotten smaller. Depending on how big my space is, I fill it up. And with photography, you can pretty quickly do that. But I keep printouts of things that I like, and it was surely much more. It was at least more than a year later. I finally zeroed in on a story where I could use that work. That also happened with Weber's interrogations. You get interested in something and you work to try to find a home for it. That doesn't mean you're going to get it that week. Sometimes it's months later. But if you see something good, at least for me, you know, my mind is not that big, but I have enough memory still in there that I don't forget things that I see and that impressed me the first time. At the same time, when I say that, I want to encourage people for all the times I haven't written back to please be persistent, because sometimes you fall off the edge. But to continuously believe in what you're doing and to keep getting your ideas out there. You'd be surprised. At least I hope at one point to return your call.
Is there an
Maybe for the
optimal
magazine,
frequency?
maybe for a show downtown, you know, or
Right.
certainly people often call me and ask me if I know someone in another region who's working on a certain story. I won't mention their names right now, but we exchange that kind of information sometimes, you know, in New York and in other places when people, for instance, Syria is a great idea. I got calls from several news organizations around the world asking me who I knew in Syria. And that's just, you know, one example. But yeah, you share that kind of information. If I see something that I realize cannot possibly happen in Newsweek in any kind of timely matter, I will try to spread the word to other people. And to the extent that I can introduce it to other people, I do that. At the same time, the photographers probably sent the link to everyone.
Right.
But you know, it's the idea, the wonder is to encourage thinking and the creativity of thought and ideas. I mean, it's a challenging thing to make a picture of anything. And then to have the courage to show it, I admire people who do that.
You know, this last bullet point here that talks about essentially photographers working on speculation.
Mm,
You mentioned something when in our pre-call yesterday where people like Teru Kugiyama are not shooting with the expectation of getting published. They're shooting because the story interests them.
yes.
Can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think that Teru is not against the idea of being published. But I think for, as an example, he and so many other peoples, when they devote themselves to going out to a region, you know, in some cases, people do go in for a couple of days, and then they're out, and they have a couple of pictures published somewhere. Their assignment is ended, and it's over after that. But a lot of freelancers are not in that position right now, and as they engage in certain areas, some remain committed to the story and dig deeper and deeper into the depths of it, and they find support where they can find it. But when they don't have it, they continue to do the work. They initiate a lot of stories because they believe in conditions or, you know, unrest in the South Sudan. I mean, we worked recently with this young guy, Trevor Snap. Trevor spent about 3 years in what was the Sudan, now is the South Sudan, and he's looked at the country in a very dimensional way, and he's putting together an entire sort of, you know, iPad app, which is going to be book form, to basically engage all these different layers of a place as complicated as the South Sudan. You know, when I first called him, we were going to do a story, this was more than a year ago, on that region. I talked to him, I talked to Pete Muller, I talked to a bunch of other people I know, and the first thing I asked them is what is going on there? But I don't even know how to approach it or what to pursue. It's geographically vast. Where are the tense points? How do you approach it thoughtfully? And those, both of them and several other people were enormously helpful to me just because of their knowledge on the ground. So I know that's a somewhat long-winded answer, but people stay on in regions to continue to remove layers of issues which are extremely complex, extremely complex. And there are photographers in many countries around the world who do that.
How important is it to go abroad into these hotspots in order to gain your attention personally?
Well, I mean, because I am particularly interested in not only those hotspots, but if you've got a great story from, I don't know, Angola, or you've got something great from some place in Central Asia, I'm interested in those stories too. But it's quite true, the international ring of a story tends to garner my attention in a quicker way. But that doesn't mean I haven't and don't see and don't welcome and am not thrilled by great stories made right here in the States. And you can just, again, bring up someone like Eugene Richards or Brendan Keneally, or look at Seamus Murphy's work, who's covered Afghanistan and was just in Syria, but, is working on an entire America project. So there's a relationship between the two, but essentially, you don't have to leave the country to make a name for yourself. Many people don't do that. And there's a lot of creativity right outside your doorway, and people have done astonishingly good work all over this country. And God knows there are enough socially critical issues to address here. Absolutely. So I just happen to be interested in stories that relate more to South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa.
I've run into some photographers who, when they are working on long-term projects, and they send, a broader edit that might be 2 years of their life, and that
Yeah.
edit gets reduced into a much smaller edit for the magazine, and they get really upset
Oh yeah.
at the way that. Can you talk to us about the dynamic there, and why should a freelancer who's really putting their heart and soul and their money and time into a project, quote, trust the Newsweek editor to do a good job with the editing and be truthful to their vision?
Well, hopefully, that again, I've been here for a long time, and when I look at Philippe, his name, I have the worst time pronouncing Dudois, who is in West Africa and the Tuareg areas, the deserts there. And of course, they just had that coup, um, and his work in the western reaches of the Sahara, I thought would be absolutely perfect to put in the magazine. But I didn't have the finances to support that body of work. I wrote to him directly. He was interested in it. I think he implicitly trusted me with the 2, 3, 6 pages I could possibly get. And my attempt is, when I show a body of work, to make that not an absolutely final moment for the work. I'm actually trying to show it to the world and hoping that if people see the work that someone like Philippe's done, and the names again go on and on and on, if people see that work, they'll be interested to both use it again, talk to that photographer about going on another assignment, engage him, realize that there's an enormously talented person out there who is worth pursuing. So I know that that's a somewhat long-winded way, but trust is something that you develop. Have people rejected me and said, "Forget it, I'm not going to allow you to run my work because I put too much into it and you're not giving it enough space"? Many have. And I've also said to many, "Hey, look, you put too much work into that. I'm not going to run just one picture of it." So it works both ways.
I love
Long
these
form stuff
images.
and long term is quite an amazing thing to do for a photographer. And the last thing I'll say about the question you posed earlier is, if things are working, all I can ever possibly do is hope to contribute to kind of this ongoing engagement a photographer has with a story or a body of work. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough, you can give seed money to initiate a project. Sometimes people have been working on that project for a year, and you can come up, because you've seen it, an assignment for them to continue a portion of that. I mean, if you're super lucky, you give them enough money to try to finish it. But I don't work in a place where I can fundamentally support the entire making of it. News sometimes, but anyway, it's humbling. I'll tell you that. It's very humbling.
I love these images by Alejandro Cartagena,
Yeah.
probably because not only are they kind of so similar to one another, being kind of this overview shot of the trucks, but there's a very kind of colorful and graphical nature to it
Yeah,
that
there's no
makes it,
question about it. I
yeah,
mean,
seem more fun in a way.
yeah, you see the one on the lower left. That's the headshot I sent to you of me. No, I'm only kidding. No, here's an example you asked earlier. Does it matter to go to festivals? Does it matter to look at people's books and look at their work? And my answer to that is yes. I met Alejandro Cartagena at the Santa Fe workshop. And at that time, he was making what I thought was a startlingly fine body of work on the growth of suburbs in Monterrey, Mexico. I always liked the work, eventually came out with it in a book. And then suddenly, and this is a month ago, I saw this set of pictures. And again, it's something I printed out, just the whole idea, the angle, the aesthetics of it, the visual, this way of getting into the lives of people in the back of trucks taken from an overpass worked for me enormously well. So I presented it to the editor and they loved it. So we ran, however, 4 pages of it. But he has so many more than that. We could have run 10 pages of it. All I could get was 4. And we plugged his book a little bit, but it's enough, to begin with, because then Newsweek Japan's interested in it. People in Germany call to ask about it. And I hope by running it, I'm also doing something for Alejandro, because I think he's an amazingly talented people. Surely many people know who he is, but a lot of people don't. Many people don't. And hopefully I've done a little bit to bring people to, bring attention to him.
So is
He's
each
got a gift.
edition paying for usage, and what about online usage? Is that
I
also
made a, I
compensated?
made, I made a deal with him, and then online made a deal with him.
Yeah.
Was it a great deal? No. Was it solid? It was pretty good.
But
But
that's sort of the reality of
that
publishing.
deal will grow because if the Germans who express interested in it, they will make their own deal with him. Newsweek Japan also pays if they run it. So what I give initially grows if the timing's right, because online pays more. As I say, the Germans, the Japanese, they'll pay more. So my original deal becomes it's a starting point.
Yeah,
But they're wonderful. No, is that just me? I love these. I'm
I love them
glad to
too.
hear you like them.
Hey, Jamie, I want to thank you so much for spending the hour with us. It's
Hey, that was a
tremendously
fast
insightful.
hour.
I know, it went by so quickly.
Thanks for putting up with me, and I want to say hello to everyone out there. I know a bunch of people wrote, so
So this recording will be available later this week. I also want to let the audience know about a photo conference that we're throwing together in New York City in the fall. We're trying to do a cross-section of business, technology, culture, and photography, and bringing together companies like Facebook, Google, Tumblr, Blurb, and some fantastic photographers and photo editors as well. So that you can find more information at photoshelter.com/luminance. But once again, thank you so much, Jamie, for a wonderful, wonderful time. And
thank you.
hopefully we'll see you again.
Yeah, I'll see you in New York this fall.
Great.
All
Take
right,
care.
wonderful. Bye.
Bye-bye.